everyone, this is 5.3 Expansion and Slavery, where we focus a little bit more on expansion and exactly how that led us into the Civil War. So the objective for today is that you will explain how expansion led to a divided nation over slavery. And the notes for today, that went fast, the evolution of political parties and the compromises. So evolution of political parties. We talked a lot about political parties, but I thought a chart might be helpful on how these political parties developed, because it also kind of gives you a little bit of framework for where people stood in this division that was occurring, sectionalism and division that was occurring that eventually led us into the Civil War. So in our last unit, you probably remember us talking about the Jacksonian Democrats, the common man who supported him. For the 1834 election, politics changed slightly. And instead of it being the Jacksonian Democrats, it just became the Democratic Party. And then an anti-movement to Jackson, the Whigs were created. And they were a reform movement. They were anti-Jackson. But they didn't last for very long, actually. They only lasted for maybe about 20 years before they broke apart, and eventually then they became the Republicans, they broke apart into two groups. One part became Republican, which was the anti-slavery group. So when I say Republican and Democrat, I'm not necessarily meaning the same Republican and Democrat parties that we have today. They've changed a lot since then with their views on politics. And in this case, in the 1854, Republicans were more focused with the anti-slavery movement. There was also another group that formed out of this called the Know-Nothings, and this is kind of unique because they formed out of the same group, but this group was very much anti-immigration. At this point in time, there were a lot of immigrants entering the country, and these groups were against immigration and immigrants coming in. The compromises. So because we were expanding and adding new land, there was debate over whether or not this land would be free state or slave state. And so there was a variety of compromises that were created in order to try to help and address this issue. The first are issues that are solutions developed by Henry Clay, who is on the top right-hand corner here. Henry Clay came up with the Missouri Compromise, which we talked about, so I'm not going to make you guys write much down about this. But essentially, the Missouri Compromise said that Missouri can enter the Union as a slave state, but Maine then will be a free state to keep the balance in Congress equal. The other part of this was that slavery would be banned anywhere north of the 3630 parallel line, which does in fact go below or kind of through parts of Missouri, but because Missouri was added as a slave state, that wasn't counted. The Compromise of 1850. So a couple of years later, we had the Compromise of 1850. This was after the Mexican War. And essentially what was decided by Henry Clay and some others was this idea of popular sovereignty, where local officials could vote for or against slavery. So it would essentially be up to the officials in that area or territory if they wanted to allow slavery or not. Now, the other part of this was the fugitive slave laws, which was very controversial for people in the North, because what it essentially said was that they had to return a runaway slave if a runaway slave was found. Senator Stephen Douglas, which is here on the bottom right-hand corner, he created the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which again was based on this idea of popular sovereignty. They could vote however they wanted to about slavery. The problem being, though, that it was extremely bloody battle, and it eventually became known to be Bloody Kansas because there was so much violence and uprising against this decision that's what ended up being called. And that is it for today.